After I posted episode 28, I realized I'd left out one of the biggest observations from the week. I'm surprised I forgot to mention it, as it was foundational to Investigation 1 into the Nephilim and Genesis 6. But one of the most obvious and relatively common objections to the angelic, half-breed, hybrid interpretation of Genesis 6 is that it's biologically impossible. In fact, that's essentially the argument Sextus Julius Africanus made nearly 1800 years ago when articulating the Sethite view for the first documented time. Are they not angels, all ministering spirits? The author of Hebrews writes, which Africanus used in his Chronographiae. And Jesus says the angels in heaven do not marry in Matthew. So how could spiritual beings possibly produce biological offspring? That's a fair question. But what if it's answering a question the passage never actually asked? Genesis 6:4 says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men of old, men of renown. Came in is the Hebrew verb bo, usually translated come, bring, in, enter. Now, sometimes that expression absolutely refers to sexual relations, but the word itself simply means to go in, to enter, to come into. The biological conclusion is something we infer from the context, because it says, bore them children. And that made me stop, again, because maybe we've been assuming something the text never explicitly explains. Notice what happens. Everyone immediately begins asking, how could angels reproduce? How could spirits have DNA? How could this possibly be biological? And suddenly the whole discussion becomes science fiction. But Scripture never says, and this is how spiritual genetics work. We're the ones asking that question. And the fact of the matter is, Satan doesn't need biological hybrids. He never has. Jesus says he comes to steal, kill, and destroy. In John, Scripture describes Satan as the deceiver, the accuser, the tempter, the father of lies. None of those require changing human DNA. They require influencing human hearts. Then I started wondering, what if we've made another false binary? What if we've assumed the only way someone could become a hybrid is biologically? Because Scripture already describes another kind of mixture. It already speaks constantly about divided people. James calls the double-minded man unstable in all his ways. Paul speaks about the fellowship between light and darkness. And Jesus says no one can serve two masters. Idolatry itself is a kind of divided allegiance, a divided identity, almost a spiritual hybrid. I'm not saying that's what Genesis 6 means, just suggesting an alternative frame. And remember where episode 28 ended. If reality is larger than the 4 dimensions we ordinarily perceive, perhaps there's actually 10 dimensions, 6 of which are imperceptible, as Nachmanides and Superstring theory propose. If there really are aspects of reality we cannot presently observe, then perhaps we should be slower to insist that every interaction Scripture describes must fit neatly inside modern scientific categories. Again, I'm not claiming that's the answer. I'm saying we don't currently have sufficient grounds to dismiss that possibility simply because we can't imagine the mechanism. Dr. Michael Heiser points out that Bene ha Elohim, which we translate the sons of God in Genesis 6:4, is the same Hebrew expression used in the book of Job, when the sons of God present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came with them. These are clearly heavenly spiritual beings, so Heiser refers to these as the divine council. Psalm 82:1 portrays God standing in the midst of his heavenly council. Many English translations render this divine assembly or congregation. The ESV uniquely says divine council. The Hebrew word there, edah, is most often translated congregation, followed by company, followed by assembly. But the second part of the verse adds even more interest and context. This is commonly translated, he judges in the midst of the gods, in the midst of the rulers. The Hebrew word there is actually elohim, which is most often translated by a long shot, over 2,300 times in the KJV, as God with a capital G, followed by God lowercase. And in Second Temple Judaism, these rebellious heavenly beings came to be identified with the watchers described in 1 Enoch. Whether you ultimately accept that interpretation or not, notice where the discussion begins. It begins with spiritual beings. Scripture already teaches that spiritual beings can deceive, tempt, accuse, oppress, and even possess human beings. So, perhaps we've been too quick to assume that if Genesis 6 describes interaction between heavenly beings and humanity, the only category available is biology. But then I came right back to the conclusion of episode 28. Even if the angelic view is correct, even if the Sethite view is correct, even if Genesis 6 is stranger than either side currently understands, my responsibility tomorrow morning doesn't change. Christ still tells me to love God, love my neighbor, love my enemy, forgive, pray, walk in the Spirit. So, whether the corruption in Genesis 6 spread biologically, socially, spiritually, or in some way that's stranger than fiction, Scripture's answer remains exactly the same. Remain faithful. Interestingly enough, after I finished recording episode 28, my cousin Dylan and I were discussing it. And it's cool because it was from discussions with him that I got the idea for episode 28. But he said something that struck with me. Every idol requires a sacrifice. I think he's right, regardless of who came up with it first. Whatever we worship eventually reshapes us. Whatever sits at the top of our hierarchy will eventually ask something of us. Our time, our attention, our peace, our relationships, sometimes even our humanity. Maybe that's the timeless truth beneath Genesis 6. Not merely that something crossed a boundary, but that whenever God's order is abandoned, creation itself becomes disordered. Whether that disorder is biological, social, spiritual, or all three, the answer has never changed. Walk with God like Noah. Remain faithful, and let every mystery lead you closer to Christ, not farther from him, because he is coming soon in one way or another, whether it be the second coming or when each of us die. He's coming soon. So we may as well get to know him now.
He's coming soon. Nearly 2,000 years ago, the Son of God came into the world. Man was a slave to sin and death. He came to set us free. Jesus promised eternal life to all who put their trust in him. Then he went to heaven to prepare us a home for all eternity. Now he's coming soon. Jesus is coming, coming to take all who love him to a home prepared for us glory. He's coming soon. Jesus is coming.